magic word. Here in the secret kindergarten, the world's best show for kids is starting. The Secret Kindergarten Radio Show. Use your ears and your imagination. We're going to play, we're having fun. The Magic Secret Kindergarten on the Revolution Radio Station.
Hello, hello. Welcome back to the Secret Kindergarten. Ooh. I want to talk to you about the fairies. Yeah, true story, as far as I'm concerned. Have you ever wondered who makes the flowers grow? And how they come to be such pretty shapes and such pretty colors? You remember I told you about the fairies you see in the beautiful world at night? Well, that is just their work. They make the flowers grow, and they spend a great deal of time trying to make them grow in as pretty a shape and of as beautiful a color as possible. It is very clever of them, isn't it? You and I couldn't do it a bit. We shouldn't know how. But then, God does not want us to do that. He wants us to do other sorts of work in the world. The fairies are very proud of their work, and they like it to be noticed and appreciated. When we admire a beautiful flower and feel glad because it is so pretty, the little fairy who made it is so pleased. But if you pick it roughly and then are careless about it and perhaps throw it away on a hot, dusty road, the little fairy's heart is hurt. She loved the flower and made it as well as she ever could. And she does not like to see all her work spoiled. Besides, the poor flower, although it cannot think like you and me, and can only feel a very, very little, can yet feel enough to be a tiny little bit sad when it is not treated kindly. You see, the flower and the fairy who made it are some of the very little ones in God's world. We want to be very gentle with the wee ones, don't we? Some of the fairies help the insects to make their wonderful coats. They paint them all those glowing colors on their wings and backs. And I expect the butterfly is very pleased to have such a nice dress made for him by a dear little fairy, don't you? Then there are other sorts of fairies who live in the trees and wear green dresses, just the same color as the trees. What do they look like? Well, something like us, only smaller and brighter and more beautifully dressed. Some of them are as small as a bird, the ones who make flowers. But the ones who live in the trees are larger, sometimes as big as 3 feet. They wear the most beautiful dresses of all the most wonderful colors, and so radiant. And they are very lively and light and love to dance all together in the sunbeams. They are very shy and generally run away when they see people coming. And they do not like to live too near a great number of houses because so much noise frightens them. Sometimes, out in the woods, if you are very quiet and feel very happy, a little fairy will come near and have a good look at the funny human being. They can see us, although we do not often see them. Would you like to see them? Perhaps you will one day. There are fairies who live in the streams and in the sea, and who play up and down the water and make it sparkle and run. The river fairies wear green dresses like the tree fairies, but the most wonderful of all are the sea fairies. Their great sport is to ride on top of the big waves and to splash up the white foam when the wave breaks. Then some live always up in the air, among the clouds, and they have a great time making the sky look pretty. They weave the clouds into all sorts of funny and wonderful shapes, and they are very fond of making the clouds into the pattern we call mackerel sky. These fairies have such long hair, and when they fly in the wind, their long hair flies out behind them. Then there are the funny little ones who live down in the earth, down in the mines, and right down under the earth. Their work is to help make the useful and beautiful things we dig up out of the earth, iron and gold and silver and sparkling gems. Sometimes, deep down in a mine, when all is still, men can hear them knocking and tapping. They are called the gnomes, and if you were to see one, you would see a funny little dumpy figure with a peaked cap and a long beard. Once a friend of mine was lying down in the sun on a lonely moor in Scotland, when some of the little gnomes came creeping cautiously up to have a look at him. He had to be very quiet, for if he stirred, they ran back again and hid themselves behind the big stones and boulders on the moor. And another time, when he was sitting by a stream in a wood, he looked up and saw a lovely little flower fairy swinging on a stamen of a honeysuckle flower and watching him. You see, the fairies do a very great deal of work in the world. They make it useful and beautiful for us. So I think we ought to remember it and send them thanks in our thoughts. Don't you? We couldn't get along without them. And remember that even if you cannot catch sight of the fairies, you cannot help feeling the effects of their work all day long. It is the fairies who make the flowers grow and the winds blow, and they make the fire burn too. The fairies who make the fire burn are very gorgeous fairies. They wear golden red dresses, and when the fire burns merrily and roars up the chimney in winter, the fire fairies just love it and fly up the chimney with the flames. We couldn't live in the fire, could we? It would burn us all up if we tried to, but the fire fairies like it. They could not live anywhere else. So you see, the fire fairies make the fire burn, and the water fairies make the water sparkle, and the wind fairies make the breezes blow, and the flower fairies make the trees and flowers grow pretty. What shall we do without them? Let us say hello to the roses as we go by, and to the little fairy who made them. Okay, I have another story to read you, and that's going to bring us to the bottom of the hour. So it is big fat story time! And it's a story with the character Jack. It's a Jack tale called Soldier Jack. All right, so buckle up, buckaroos. Here we go. I'm going to quickly take a sip of my tea. Because it's just after 6 o'clock in the morning here. And I got to be awake. All right, here we go. Well, Jack finally joined the king's army and went off to the wars. He fought first in one country and then in another, and did pretty well. He served 30 years, and then they told him he could go on back home, so they gave him his discharge, which means they let him leave the army. And Jack hit the road. Now, back in those days, soldiers didn't get paid, and all they gave a man when he left the army was 2 loaves of bread. Jack was walking on the highway with those loaves of bread, and they were stuck under his arm. And when he met up with a beggar, and the beggar asked Jack for something to eat, so Jack gave him one of his loaves of bread. Then directly he met an old man with a long grey beard, who asked Jack for some bread. Jack cut the other loaf in 2 and gave the older fella half of it and went on. But he thought about it, and then he turned back and caught up with the old man and said, "I didn't do the right thing for you. I gave another man a whole loaf, and I only gave you half a one. Here is the rest of the loaf." The old man thanked Jack and said, "Well, now you're all right, and here's something I'm going to give you." He handed Jack a sack he had across his arm and said, "If ever you want to catch anything, you take this sack and hold it open with one hand and slap it with the other hand and say, 'Wickety whack, into my sack,' and it'll get right in this sack for you." Then he took a little vial out of his pocket and gave that to Jack and said, "Now this little glass vial will tell you whether somebody who's sick will die or get well. All you have to do is fill it up with clear spring water and look through it. If you see death standing at the foot of the bed, that person will get well. But if death is waiting at the head of the bed, you'll know they are about to die." Jack thanked the old man and went on, with the sack over his shoulder and the glass in his pocket. He travelled on, and along toward night the road went through a woodland, and Jack heard some turkeys clucking. Jack looked up in a big oak tree, and there sat 9 wild turkeys. So Jack opened the sack, slapped it, and said, "Wickety whack, into my sack." And all 9 of them turkeys flew right down and got in the sack. Jack pulled the mouth of the sack together and went on. He came to a town when it was dark, went to a hotel and asked if he could swap his turkeys for a room and something to eat. The hotel manager weighed the turkeys, and Jack got a room and supper for breakfast, and a little change as well. The next day Jack went on, and at about 12 he passed by a big fine house near the road. It looks like nobody lived there. The yard was covered in weeds, and there were no curtains in the windows. And Jack got to wondering about such a good house being empty. He met a boy in the road directly, and the boy told Jack the house was haunted. Jack asked who the place belonged to, and the boy told him. So Jack went down to that man's house to talk to him about it. "Yes," the man told him, "that house has been haunted for 30 or 40 years. Nobody can stay there overnight. I've promised several fellows that if they stay all night up there, I'd give them the house and 1,000 acres and give them $1,000, but nobody has ever broken the haunt yet. I'll try it, says Jack. I'll stay there all night. Well, that man took him up on it, and they got some food for Jack to eat while he stayed there. And the man took Jack on to the house and helped him build up a fire, and then left him there. Jack sat down by the fire and got out his pipe and smoked a while. Then he made his supper and ate it and lit up his pipe again and sat down next to the fire and waited. At around midnight, Jack heard a great roar and something knocking around upstairs and wheels rolling and chains rattling. And then 3 little devils came jumping down the stair steps. Jack sat right on. The little devils had some sacks of money with them, and they came over to the fire and asked Jack if he would play a poker game. Jack didn't have any money except the change from the hotel, but he sat down and invested it and started to win money off the little devils. The devils lost every time, and they started trying to peep to see Jack's cards, but he was slick and played close to the floor. And it wasn't long till he cleaned them out of all their money. Then they got mad and started to threaten Jack. And so Jack picked up that sack and held it open and said, "Wickety-whack! Into my sack!" And all 3 of those little devils fell right down into the sack. Jack pulled the mouth of the sack tight and tied it, put it in one corner, and then he laid down by the fire and went to sleep. The next morning, the man came back, and there was Jack cooking his breakfast. Jack told him what happened and showed him the sack full of devils. So that man gave Jack the house and the 1,000 acres and paid him $1,000. And then they took the little devils down to the blacksmith shop and hired the blacksmith to sledge them for 24 hours. "I want you to lay the hammer to them," Jack told him. So he did that, and it was a sight how the sparks flew. There wasn't a thing but ashes in Jack's sack when that blacksmith was done. So Jack paid him and took the sack on home and put it up on the fireboard. Well, Jack fixed up the house and hired boys to help him tend the land, and he lived on there by himself and took it easy. He was getting to be an old man, Jack was, and he didn't work too hard. He enjoyed looking after everything and making little improvements around his place. But he had plenty of money, so he hired most of the heavy work to be done and saw to it that the boys made the crops pay pretty well. Then one day, word came down in that settlement that the king's daughter was sick, and all the doctors thought she would die. They said she couldn't be cured, so the king had all the doctors' heads cut off. Then the king, he put out word that if anybody could cure his girl, he'd pay them several $1,000s. Well, Jack, he didn't want the money, but he thought he'd go up there and see about that girl. So he took the sack and stuck that little glass vial in his coat pocket and went on to the king's house. The king took him in where his daughter was in the bed, and Jack sent for some clear spring water. They brought it to him, and he filled up that little vial, held it up and looked through it, and there was Death, standing at the head of the bed, grinning. Jack set the vial down and opened the sack, struck it with his hand and said, "Wickety whack, into my sack." And death fell down into the sack. Jack tied the sack up tight, and the king's daughter got well, and they brought the money to Jack, but he wouldn't take it. Then Jack went on home, and he had one of the boys take that sack and tie it up in the top of a big poplar tree standing there in the yard. Well, Jack kept on with his place and his house. He noticed his hair was going grey and his beard was getting long. But Jack enjoyed life and never paid much attention to the almanac. He kept a calendar so he could tell when it was Sunday and not to work, but he never noticed what year it was. He stayed at home by himself most of the time and didn't get out much to go anywhere. Then one spring morning, Jack decided he'd take a walk over in the settlement, see friendly faces and have a little pleasure talking to people. He went down the road and met up with an old lady. Jack looked at her, and he had never seen anybody as old as she was. Her face was so wrinkled and leathery, it was terrible to look at. Her eyes set way back in her head, and her white hair was so thin, it was almost gone. She was stooped over so her nose almost bumped her knees when she walked. Jack stopped and said, "How do you do, ma'am?" She started straightening up, with her bones cracking and her head shaking like palsy, and finally she got her eyes up where she could look at Jack. "How do you do, son?" she says. "How are you getting on?" Jack asked her. "Oh," she says, "it's awful." "Why, what's the matter?" says Jack. "Matter?" she says. "Why, living as long as this, that's what it is." "Yes," Jack says, "you do look sort of old. Just how old are you, ma'am?" "Next June," she says, "on the 12th day of the month, I'll be 206 years old." "Well, I declare," Jack says, "I never heard of anybody getting to be that old." "It ain't right," says the old lady, "living that long and not being able to die." "You mean you want to die?" "Oh, Lord, yes," she told him. "Well, why can't you die?" "Why, haven't you heard?" the old lady asked him. "Some fool's got death shut up in a sack. Nobody's died around here for 142 years. And you know that's against nature now, isn't it?" Jack turned around right there and went on back home. He thought about what the old lady said for a day or two. Then he called one of his boys to climb up in that poplar tree and bring him down the sack that was up there. The boy climbed up and brought the sack into Jack. Jack took his knife and cut the sack where he had tied it, and when death got loose, all the old folks began dropping dead wherever they were. And Jack was the first one that death got. So what did you think about that story, eh? Did you like my old lady voice? Do you think I should do voices when I read stories, or should I just keep the same voice all the way through? What do you reckon? That was touch and go there for a minute. And what do you think about, do you think it's scary? Do you get scared? Do you get upset? I don't think you do. I think it's okay. And that's why we're bringing these old stories back. Because there's something in it that's special just for you kids. And I'd love to know what you think. You tell your mum and dad what you think about it. And what about fairies? Did you know that the fairies, the rock fairies and the stone fairies, they like to help me, believe it or not. And that's why I love telling stories about fairies. Because, I know it's a true story, and all you kids out there know it's a true story. So all us adults just need to get on board. Thanks so much for listening. Remember, I love you. Bye.